To get it in 1983, and I actually restored the car with the help of a lot of friends and family, and had it here at the import show in 1985, I think. I actually showed the car the first time in Hershey in 1984, and I missed the anniversary of the attraction. Was in April. I actually showed it in October of that year. So, of course, it's been at this show for every year since then. Now, I brought a little bit of show and tell along today, and then I'm going to turn it over to Carl. How many of you have heard of what is called a float wheel? How many of you actually have ever touched one or seen one or know much about it? I look at this wheel and I really didn't do much research on the development of it. It was done by Michelin Tire. I'm sure it was an early attempt at lowering rolling weight. This rim, although I thought it would be a lot lighter, it's only 6 pounds lighter than a regular steel wheel. That's without the wheel cover and the hubcap. The strange thing about it is where the regular disc wheels are made of very thick, hardened steel, this wheel is made of sheet metal. And when you look at it, it looks like it's got a very, very heavy reinforced rim, but when you tap on it, it's hollow. And they're very, very susceptible to damage. They're very, very susceptible to rusting. And because of that, they've become very, very rare. I was lucky enough to pick this one up, and I'll probably keep it for the rest of my life because it's basically going to be painted someday and be hung on the wall. But anybody that wants to take a look at it is welcome to. It's got a completely different wheel cover system of the other tractions. It's actually got what is called a spider. Clips onto the wheel that then holds the wheel cover. But it is again, Michelin Tire used these cars because they became basically the owner of it. I'm pretty sure that CITROENS as a whole became their test bed. So, does anybody have any questions about what I've spoken about or about the 11? If not, I'm going to turn it over to Carl, and he can tell us a little bit about his 15.6. Yes.
Were they ever sold new in the U.S.?
Well, that's an interesting question. I don't know that I've really ever had an absolute answer about that. What I can tell you is that there was a company, there was actually a dealership, I guess you would call it more than a dealership, in Southern California. And this was clear back in the 30s. It was called Challenger Motors. Challenger Motors was in business until probably 10 years ago. Now, I used to sell them parts. Of course, the ownership had changed several times, but beginning in probably, as far as I know, maybe 37, something like that, they imported the CITROEN 11 CVs here, and they actually modified the lighting and a lot of things to meet the California Department of Transportation, and they actually used their own serial number plate, which usually the serial numbers corresponded to the French serial number, but instead of saying it was made by CITROEN, it had a brass plate that actually said Challenger Motors. As far as whether any of them were actually sold here by other dealers, I think there's a very high probability that there were a few, but not in great numbers. Not in great numbers. I know that CITROEN in New Jersey, New York City, the East Coast distributor actually had a couple 15.6s that they used back in the early days before the D's, when the D's were in their infancy. So I think there's a possibility they sold a handful, but not very many. Not very many.
That was brought in by Challenger, isn't it?
Well, there's a CITROEN diesel truck that's actually owned by a gentleman about 30 miles from here, and it had an interesting history too, because that truck was imported by Challenger Motors back in the early 30s, and they brought it in as just basically a chassis. From what we can tell from looking at it, the car 16.6. Before he starts though, I'd like to also recognize the CXs. I have to tell you, I really didn't have time to get a seminar together on the CXs, but this is the 40th anniversary of the Citroën CX. So it's a big year for Citroën. And Lou Bevere's is a beautiful example, so we thank him for bringing that up here. Carl, go for it.
Okay, I'm not sure if I can compete with the fans, but my teeth flying out. So, if you have not seen this book, it is an excellent book about the traction Avant. It pretty much tells you everything about it. I bought this here at one of the booths over there, I think the first year I came to the show, which is maybe 5 years ago, right? Now, I'm certainly not going to tell you anything more about the traction Avant than this guy or this guy know. So I'm just going to talk about mine a little bit. But there is one thing I read recently on the internet that I found very interesting. I can't remember if it was the engineer or the designer that decided that the traction Avant should be front wheel drive. And I wish I could find where I read that. But the person that was trying to convince them that it should be front wheel drive put a box in front of the rest of them and he said, push that box straight across the table. And it fell. He said, now pull the box straight across the table. Okay, it's going to be front wheel drive. That was it. That was pretty cool, I thought. Okay. My traction Avant, I had one 53 years ago when I was a GI in France. Drove it all over Europe, wherever I could go on what little money an American soldier made. Right? My car I had in France was an early 1952 model. This one is a late 1952 model. There were a couple of changes. The trunk, as Brad mentioned, was not a hump trunk before that. I'm not exactly sure when the date was that it changed, and I lost my page in here again. Oh, my car in France was an early model that did not have a hump trunk. It had the spare tire. But there were aftermarket things on the Citroëns, and this is the trunk that was on my Citroën in France. I actually liked it better because the whole trunk didn't lift up and you didn't have to worry about sealing them weather-wise, and just with the little hatch in there, and I could jam more stuff in it, right? The other thing was the turn signals. My car in France, even though it was a 52, had the swinging arm turn signals between the doors, and what I call the overnight parking light, instead of being up where the turn signals were on my other car, were on the front fender. Those little night lights that you put on. And then the other disturbing thing that I find about the car, that when I owned a car in France at the age of 19, my stomach wasn't near as close to the steering wheel as it is now. So I don't know why they moved that.
Right,
But,
right. Yeah, right.
Even I have to move the seats back. So I found this car in Chicago. I hadn't really thought that much about the car, except I must have said at least 1,000 times, I should have brought that car home. But I needed the money. I had not been to France, or I had not been to Spain yet, or to England. So I sold the car for $200. Oh, by the way, the car I had in France, I paid $125 for. 2 taillights now cost me $125. The guy I bought the car from in France, I thought sold it to me pretty cheap, and I found out after about 3 or 4 weeks of driving it why. Because I came back from town one day and I opened the hood to check the oil and I heard this sizzling sound. And I opened up the hatch where the oil goes in and I really heard it sizzling. I pulled out the dipstick and I had about that much oil/water on it. Pulled the head off of it and I found out I had about 6 or 7 cracks in the block. So 20 kilometers down the road, there was a huge junkyard run by a Second World War American soldier who met a French girl, married her, and stayed in France. to this day, I can't remember the guy's name. But anytime I ever needed anything from my Citroën, I went to him first to see if he had something in his junkyard, or if I needed a part, he'd write it down for me on a piece of paper and I'd take it to the local Citroën dealer. Well, now I needed an engine block. So I went down to him, I said, would you happen to have an engine block for a Citroën 6-cylinder? He said, I think down this row here, there's a bunch of engines in crates. There might be one for a 6-cylinder Citroën. I went down there and in the crate, 3 crates, there were 3 6-cylinder Citroën engines in Cosmoline. If any of you don't know what Cosmoline is, it's like a waxy substance the military uses to keep everything from rusting. Well, it wasn't a short block. It had the generator on it, had the starter on it, the distributor, everything. How much did it cost me? $60. This was in early 1960s. 1963, I think, was the year that Algeria finally won its independence from France. But they were fighting for their independence from France, and a whole bunch of ships went to Algeria, and they never got offloaded. They came back to France, and the stuff that was on it, for the most part, got auctioned off, and this guy bought a whole bunch of stuff, included Citroën, Renault, Simca engines. So my car in France now was up to $185, right? So it was really great. All right. Drove it all over Europe, didn't bring home. I would have had to change the headlights and all of the glass at the time, and I didn't have the money to do it, and I needed money to go to Spain and England then. So I sold it for $200. Well, maybe 6-7 years ago, we stopped at a gas station up by Penn State. Wish we could get that guy to come here. My wife said, Carl, isn't that a car over there like you had in France? I looked, I said, that's the first one I ever saw in this country. You know, some 30 years later. And so I got re-interested in Citroëns, and I started looking on the internet. My car showed up on eBay in Chicago. It didn't sell the reserve price. I called the guy, had his phone number. I said, do you still have the car? Is it for sale? He said, well, technically it was sold, but I don't have the money yet. I said, so what are you going to do? And he told me what the price was. And I said, what are you going to do? He said, well, the first guy that comes with the money has the car. So I said, I'll be there tomorrow morning, sleeping in my van, wake me up when you get me. So I've had a lot of problems with it, poor Dave, mechanically, but I stripped it down. It's been sandblasted, repainted, engine been rebuilt, transmission, brakes, just about it, front end, just about everything done to it. And I fortunately just got an award from Carlisle for it, for Winter Circle. Oh, I have not yet. Somebody please help me if you know how to find out. By the license plates, I'm told I can find out who owned it in France. The guy I bought it from was a dealer, and he had sold the guy to a restaurateur in Chicago, and he just parked it around in front of his different restaurants to attract attention. That's all I know about the car. He had it for 4 years and it sat in the warehouse for 3 years, and then he advertised it for sale. That's it. Okay, thank you. Oh, I don't know if this is available or not, but this is a book about the 75th anniversary in France, in the city of Avant. And there's conflicting reports on just how many attractions were there, but it's well over 1,000. I've heard from 1,100 to 1,700. George Dyke was there.
1165.
Pardon?
Yeah, 1165 was the official count.
1165 was the official count? Okay. Do you know if this is still available anywhere?
I'm not sure. I don't know. I don't know.
Maybe through the UK club. They might
Possibly
know.
the attraction owner.
But it's in English and French. If anybody wants to take a look at it, God, gobs of pictures of attractions.